I'm going to answer that by just thinking about why government and policy is now potentially a viable space for design. We could say over the last 15 to 20 years that design thinking or strategic designs moved from being tied up with organisational futures and strategy towards social entrepreneurship and social innovation and solving social problems, and then much more recently being developed as a capability inside particularly policy labs inspired experimental units in government entities of different kinds. And they're all very different. They have different publics, they have different drivers, they have different existing kinds of expertise and existing expectations around what is the way that you would proceed and work and sort of do organisational action. Working inside government, which I would say I'm really only beginning to understand, and I only really understand a little bit about the UK government context. I have colleagues here at Central St Martin's, for example, who are much more expert around local government, through the Public Collaboration Lab, for example, which has been a one-year, very intense project, also funded by the AHRC, involving a collaboration between University of the Arts and London Borough of Camden. So these are all quite different sites, scales, sets of concerns, sets of working practices, and in the field of policy studies, which I'm now dipping into a little, there are long-standing literatures about understanding how government proceeds, government and policy is done. So for designers or design researchers to enter into that is to think about entering into a territory that you may not know, so you probably don't know that well, and like anything you need to sort of step into it thinking I'm going to try and understand this landscape and make sense of it, and then understand the capacity for both organisational action, including action that you might yourself be involved in, which in design terms is typically a future-facing thing. Let's use these skills and capabilities we have in design to generate future directions, future questions, different understandings of the present, which are perhaps ethnographic and closer to people's experience than the way that government typically operates. So for me, policy and policy labs seem to be a very fertile space for design thinking and other kinds of exploratory expertise to be applied. But with that comes sort of great responsibility to really think about your own ethics, your own politics, the extent to which you are shaping the organisational action, the policy intent, and to be critical about what it is that you are sort of throwing and building into the work, and your own position within that. I would say that's true of all designing, particularly when there's a focus on the futures and realisation that we need to sort of live and act differently in the world because of the challenge of sustainability, for example. So it's true of all design. It just has, I think, a particular formation when you're dealing with inside a public administration which has a direct relationship with representative or possibly not democracy. So I think design is absolutely about the future and exploring and generating potential futures and doing so in the present. But it's also tied up with understanding the immediate past, the current situation, and then what shapes the immediate past through earlier results of other activity. So design is very closely tied to strategy and foresight. I'd say what I would characterise as the major differences, given that they're both future focused, is one is the level of analysis. Strategy is typically quite macro. It's about organisations and environments and actors, although in the strategy literature there is a focus on strategy as practice, for example, that looks at organisational actors and looks at the ways that organisations and individuals in organisations and discourses and materials and structures and processes lead to particular kinds of strategic action. broadly it's quite a macro discipline. Whereas I think in design we are work at a much smaller scale, maybe zooming in and out, or which also appears in actually the foresight literature. Richard Norman talks about the crane, the idea that you're at a crane, you're at a very sort of high level, and then you go down and look at something very macro. So the ability to zoom in and out is something that I would say is characterized by design, but certainly that paying also a close attention to what is the human experience in a particular situation. If you change that situation or reimagine it or introduce new technology or new materials or new kinds of behaviours, how might that situation emerge? What would that be like for a person to experience? And so retaining quite often a focus at that level, but also materialising that and making that, attending to the symbolic and affective qualities of experience. So those are things not typically done by strategy and foresight. And to explore some of those differences, I convened 3 years ago the Oxford Futures Forum, which was a two-day event in Oxford, organised with Rafael Ramirez, Cynthia Celine and Yasser Bhatti. And we're doing another one in 2017 on climate imaginaries, which has some similar qualities where we're trying to understand within the arts and humanities and design how climate change is sort of realised and manifested and explored differently, the impact of climate change imaginaries. So the key thing there is that they are all about the future and trying to understand the future and explore potential futures in the present that leads to organisational action. And as I've said, what I think design adds, or a particular lens or focus or set of material practices tied up with design, are around the material, the symbolic and affective qualities of experience, and also materialising aspects of the future in the present, and also some kind of enjoyment or definitely throwing yourself into the ambiguity and uncertainty as something to be engaged with productively rather than trying to expel it at the first opportunity.